because we were hoping to have Ross Blair on with us through a Zoom call, and tech kind of got a little complicated with that. So it's me and Paul Taylor, and it is great to have the two dads, hey?
The two overwhelmed dads, although you're much better at it now because you've got a third and you're a pro.
I've
make
been
it look so easy.
I've been broken in. But it is really great to be with you tonight on probably the most important subject of our entire Christian faith, understanding the gospel. When you get this part right, it literally changes every aspect of your Christian life. And so, Paula, on Sunday, you spent a lot of time communicating to people that God is angry against sin, and that we should basically fear his anger. Now, I've noticed that a lot of Christians don't get this.
Yeah.
And if you don't get this, it plays out in your Christian life in an incredible way. A lot of Christians kind of feel like God shouldn't be angry with them. Just speak to us about what you lose when you don't understand this anger aspect of God in the gospel.
Yeah. When you started talking about how much time I spent, I just thought it was going to be preach feedback. So let me try and work out what the question really was. No, if I don't have a sense of the righteous anger of God against sin, then I will end up being an entitled child, basically. And I'll talk about why in a moment, but what is it that parents hate about entitled children? It's not that they hate their children, but they're nervous of that thing in their kids. I think it's because, ironically, if a kid has that sort of slightly puffed up sense of what they deserve, parents actually know, even subconsciously, that the opposite of that is going to end up being the kid's story. If the child starts out with a puffed up sense that they're owed something by the world, they'll end up insecure. They won't end up super confident like it might seem. They'll end up needing to be reassured all the time that the world is really treating them as well as they think they deserve. And then when they don't get treated that well, it's a deeply unnerving thing. I think the exact same thing happens to Christians. It certainly happens to me when I've fallen into that trap of thinking, well, God just should wink at this, right? It's not such a big deal. When I haven't had the backdrop of a righteous God who should terrify me, who does terrify me, whose love for me cost him so much because he had this huge thing to overcome, that I was his enemy. If I don't start from that point, then I'm needing God to prove to me the whole time that he loves me, because I'm not really sure. I think I probably deserve to be loved. I like the idea that maybe he's cuddly, maybe he loves me, but I'm never really sure. And then if something bad happens in my life that suggests to me that maybe he doesn't love me, maybe he's not that great, the problem must be on his end, because I'm great. And so that leaves me feeling entitled and, ironically, then insecure. I don't know if that all makes sense, but to me, when a Christian grapples with the terrifying, sin deserves death. Sin is abhorrent to God. Sin is a noxious smell in his holy nostrils. I should be wiped out in his presence. Then when I hear that he loves me, that's potent love. That's love that really cost him something. That's the kind of love that I can really be secure in. And so in the same way that as a parent, I don't want my kids to be entitled. As a pastor, as a friend of Christians, I don't want Christians who float along thinking they're not really that bad, because then what you're actually saying is that God's not really that good.
Yeah, explain that a little bit, because there's a concept of gratitude in here, and there's a concept of abusing a relationship. Just explain that last little bit, especially around the abusing the relationship thing.
If you've ever been in a relationship where you've given a lot, parenthood is the obvious one, because the kids take so many years to realize just how much they owe you. But then there are all these nice kind of biological reasons that you keep on forgiving them. But in any other normal relationship, if one party has given a huge amount to the other, but the recipient doesn't know that, doesn't believe that, doesn't recognize that, doesn't live in the reality of gratitude, then not only is that person missing out on an experience of gratitude, and like psychologists will always tell you, living grateful is just really good for you. Practicing gratitude is like a healthy thing to do.
Yeah.
But remove the pop psychology thing for a second, just at a relational level. If I've given you a whole lot and you don't notice it, you don't appreciate it, you don't recognize it, then our relationship has this like dishonest thing at the root of it. And even though God is relentlessly good and he hasn't got hooks attached or whatever, still, if I'm trying to relate to someone and I think he still needs to prove his love to me, but he in fact has proved his love beyond doubt, there's so much misunderstanding at the root of that relationship that intimacy is always going to be hard. We're always going to be misunderstanding each other.
Yeah. Paula, entitled people generally end up depressed people, and very much so in Christianity. Just open that up as to why.
So the interesting thing is that the most secure people are not the ones who think they're brilliant. That's the irony. The most secure people are the ones who are able to do what Romans 12 tells us, which is to actually not consider ourselves more highly than we ought. We've got a kind of sober understanding of, I am sinful, more sinful than I thought, I'm at so much more risk than I was ever aware of. I deserve punishment that is just true of who I am. But God loved me so much that he created this incredible genius solution to the fact that, yes, he is holy, but he's also loving. I mean, God had a big problem. I had a big problem. He's holy, and I don't deserve anything other than punishment. He had a big problem. He's holy, but he loves me, and he solves it with this amazing thing, the gospel. When my starting point is, I'm not that great. Wow, he's really that great. And it's cost him so much to go after me. Then I can live really secure.
Yeah.
And that's what I was spending all that time in the preach as well, going as a species as well, as the human race. When we think we're at the pinnacle, and that's what makes us special, then what you're saying is that might is right. If you're really good, if you're really powerful, then you're special. But as soon as you're not, then you're not that impressive.
Yeah.
God's going on, it's not about what you deserve. It's just about how good I am. And that's just a really secure place to live. I didn't earn it. I can't deserve it, which means I can't undeserve it. And so I get to stay really secure. So Christians who live entitled obviously have to end up insecure because you have to keep on reassuring yourself.
Yeah. Okay. The one thing that Christians lose out on is when they're entitled. The other side of the coin is when they are moralists, when they're trying to prove to God how good they are. And both these things destroy them.
Yeah.
Speak to that side.
So we often in church circles talk about sort of legalism. Like the Jewish nation did the best job of this ever. They've been more impressive than any of us who try to start obeying the law will ever get to. They're incredible at it. And yet it turned out that wasn't enough. So because God is so holy that even an incredibly set-apart nation just couldn't live up to his standards. So I would kind of put in that entitled camp both the wishy-washy, I'm probably not that bad, and God's not that bothered, and also the highly legalistic. God is really holy, but so am I. Like that's both of those have the same problem because it's that insecurity of performance underneath it all.
Yeah.
On the other end of that spectrum, though, I suppose, is not necessarily I deserve this somehow, but actually I don't need this. That I've got life under control. That really worries me as well, and the gospel really smashes that idea too.
You used a term for that. You spoke about functional atheists.
Yeah, which
open that up a bit.
I mean, so I can't remember who I plagiarized that term from, but I mean, many people who profess faith in things, who say they believe certain things, still actually act as though they don't really believe that stuff. And so many Christians would say that they believe God provides, but then when you look at what they actually do in their bank account, it kind of tells another story that they don't, really. And that's just a tiny, kind of very obvious example to go to. But the functional atheist has believed this lie that God helps those who help themselves, or you got to look out for number one, or you make your own luck, like all that kind of classic Gary Player. The more I practice, the luckier I get. Like that, we're raised in a world that just reinforces this idea: take responsibility, take control, which is just so bad for us for a whole number of reasons. But actually, it can all be summed up in one word: stress.
Yeah.
If being on the wrong end of the gospel and that you think you can somehow deserve this lands you in insecurity, being on the other end of the gospel thinking you don't need this, that you've got this under control, lands you in stress. Because what you have is children, and I don't say this with any sort of condescension, like all of us are supposed to be kids, and God has designed, we're children, and he's designed a kindergarten for us called the gospel.
Yeah.
Where we can be kept safe, where the challenges thrown to us are the right size, where we're actually in partnership with a good dad who says, okay, I'm going to give you a chance to practice. Yeah. I'm going to give you a chance to come and sit on my knee at the workbench. We're going to do this together. Like I get goosebumps just thinking about that's how we're designed to live, not floaty, kind of surrendered, he'll do everything, you do nothing. No, that's not at all what a good dad would do. But I've created a safe place where my yoke is easy, my burden is light, I will be with you all the time, the Holy Spirit will be your counselor. Like, that's the world we're supposed to live in. But if you flicked into, I've got this under control. I'm not going to bother God too much. I'm sure he's got bigger things to worry about. Those like doff things we say, where at the core, you may say you believe certain things, but actually you function like an atheist. There is no need for a good dad in that part of my life. I'm not walking around in kindergarten in that part of my life. I'm a little child still in my nappy, but with my little business suit thinking I'm in charge of everything.
Yeah.
And that causes stress because you just can't control as much as you make your own luck would suggest that you can.
Yes.
You can't control that much. And so that for me is the other huge risk. Stress is the risk as opposed to entitlement.
Okay, so we have one group of people who are generally unhappy and insecure because they're entitled. Then you have a gospel believer who is free and childlike in his relationship with God. And then you have a legalist who is under a huge amount of stress, or a functional atheist, as you put it. He's under a huge amount of stress. And I guess in all our lives we can see all three of these things playing out.
Yeah.
And so the goal is to get into the gospel. Let's quickly define the gospel and then work it out in relationship. So I know it's not that easy to define in 30 seconds, but if we were to just quickly define the gospel very clearly, then I'm going to ask you what a centered person in the gospel is.
If this looks like it's an unscripted question, it is. The thing I think you'd start, if you want to define the gospel, is you say, God is absolutely holy and absolutely loving at the same time, and the gospel is the solution to that. Okay, so how does the solution work? The solution is that he looks at my sin and says it is more awful than you dared in your worst nightmare believe it is. Like your sin is a bigger problem than you thought it was. But his love for you is more potent than you ever dared dream possible. I think it's that. So
That's beautiful.
You're in worse shape than you thought. He is more good than you thought. And then every day you get to live in the reality of that.
Yeah, so he sends his son to be punished for your sin that is worse than you think.
And it deserved death. There was a capital punishment attached to it. This isn't some sort of vague ethics course. This is like a death sentence for this stuff.
Yeah.
Someone had to die. Someone has died. Punishment has been meted out. And that just proves how holy he is.
Yeah.
And then absolutely convinces you of how loving he is. So many Christians who start in the foothills of what God is loving and never move into he's terrifyingly holy, really shortchange themselves on how loving God is. Because how loving do you have to be if there's nothing really that much to forgive?
Yes.
But this love cost God so much. He's got so much skin in the game.
Yeah.
So, his son. So that's the gospel to me. And so now you can put me on the spot.
Let's take Ross Blair, who we really wanted to be here tonight. In terms of a gospel-centered person, I don't think I've ever seen anyone who encapsulates it in his life as much as Ross does. And he shared his testimony of being with his wife with cancer and living through that. Speak to us about what makes him so gospel-centered. How does he live that out?
From what I can see, Ross has just worked out that God never has to do another thing nice to him for the rest of his life. And he is still deeply in God's debt. He is still absolutely certain that God loves him. And I mean, he may be disagreeing with me in the comment section right now and putting that far better than I just tried to. But as his friend, I watch him and I see that he is so, there's almost like physical symptoms to it. There's certainly emotional symptoms to the weight of his debt and then what it feels like to have that removed. It's almost like every day he kind of reminds himself of just how terrifying it would be to be in the hands of a holy God. I don't know if he physically does that or goes through that process, but that's certainly what I tried to do, trying to keep up with this guy who I'm supposed to be the pastor of, and yet, is so much more grown up than me. But is that idea that, like, Paul calls Christians grace-covered, forgiven Christians to still confess their sin to one another, to still aim to be holy as their Father is holy. Like, he still expects us to talk about sin, which is strange because we're in some ways not supposed to have a sin mindset. We're supposed to just look at who Jesus is and go, that's true for me. But I think the gospel, because it's so confrontational, and this is certainly what Ross always seems to have in his mind, is it confronts sin. It says this stuff is abhorrent, it's ugly, it's corrupt. You were designed to be like this and you're not. And when you just are reminded of how far you've been how far away from what you deserve you actually are being treated, then your starting point is this like bonus, I can't believe how lucky I am, just stoked to be around kind of starting point for every day. And then you start to see that flow in quite practical ways into his relationships.
Yeah. So let's take this into the practice. I'll just throw different examples on. Let's bring, and we'll just keep using Ross as the example. Ross has an insubordinate staff member. How does he bring the gospel into the conversation he's about to have with that person?
I have no idea. But if I had to guess, or if I think about myself trying in a broken way to implement the gospel, the gospel confronts. That's the first thing. The gospel, and we sometimes talk about the unconditional love of God, and I think that is such a butchered term.
Yes.
Because it's not unconditional. The sin puts you beyond the reach of God's love. That's the problem with it. But the gospel confronts sin. The gospel goes, this doesn't matter less. It matters more than you thought. Someone has to be punished. But then God is able to do this divine exchange and open up a way in his justice to still be merciful to you. So that means that then in my life and Ross's life, firstly, when you've been wronged by someone, your starting point isn't this entitled kind of, I'm going to read the right act to this person. They should have treated me better. So you don't get on your high horse. You also aren't in a huge rush to try and force fairness because you realize that you live in an unfair position before God. So your beginning point is not, I need to fight for number one, and it's not that you've put some huge faith in fairness. Your starting point is, this is a potentially glorious human being designed in the image of God, but has for some reason fallen short of that, just like I have. And so then you begin to confront, this is a problem. It's not like I can sweep this under the rug. This is really a problem. But in relationships, the hardest thing to do is to keep hearing someone when you're feeling hurt.
Yes.
That's, I think, what the world needs the most, is somehow to find the security, the kind of resources from somewhere to stay in a relationship and keep hearing someone, even when it seems to you like they are totally in the wrong and you're totally in the right and they're hurting you. So in every conversation that starts to get intense like that, whether it's employer, employee, or friends, or in a marriage, it's the gospel's the only thing that can give you a way to say, truth still matters, I'm going to confront, but I can stay safe and secure enough that I can keep hearing you. Because I don't have to fight for number one. I'm the child in the kindergarten who's been forgiven very much.
Okay, so what you're saying is because of the gospel, you don't get defensive. You also don't sweep this thing under the rug.
You don't get tolerant.
And
you don't have to be aggressive either.
Yes. God's got vengeance is mine, says the Lord. I can relax on that one. But I'm going to call this thing out because it's sin.
Yeah.
I'm going to do it in love, okay? Let's take this to another aspect of life, because I think as you look at different aspects of life and you apply the gospel to those different aspects, what begins to happen is you start to shift how you think. So let's take, for example, you're dealing with your parents, and there's a bad discussion, you get shouted at. How does the gospel apply to a difficult, maybe dysfunctional relationship with a parent?
Yeah, so first of all, if I am certain that I've been loved, like the way we've been describing the trouble we were in and therefore the quantity and quality of love that we've received, then even though everyone should be loved by their parents, no one deserves pain, but in relationship, when you're in pain, when you're on the receiving end of pain, the starting point, churchy terminology, I know, but the starting point is I'm already so loved that in this relationship, you can't withhold anything from me that I can't afford to lose. Because I have permanent, perpetual, guaranteed love from God. So in every relationship I'm in, I'm not in that like beholden kind of, if you withdraw your approval, I'm dead. Yeah. And that's so often, because you mentioned fathers, and so often we're desperate for our dad's approval. And when things get funky, it's because that's being withdrawn or kind of traded. Yeah. If you, then I'll love you, then I'll be proud of you. It may not play out like that, but in almost every situation relationally, to me it seems like if I've got myself so dependent on you that there are some things I just can't call out because I can't do without your approval, or I can't do without your love, or I can't do without whatever, then I'm in such a powerless position. Then I'm kind of at your mercy. And so then what people tend to do is they try to manipulate or control back or, like, get you to change the way you're behaving by some subtle means.
Yeah.
And that's when it always goes pear, as opposed to being able to say, there's nothing you can take from, I will grieve if you don't love me. I'll grieve if you withdraw your approval. I'm going to let you know that that's what I need. I'm going to show up in my relationships. I'm not going to pretend. I'm going to actually own, hey, I have these needs. I'd love you to treat me like that. It sucks for me when you treat me like that. But you are able to set the other person free and say, look, if you don't choose to love me that way, then I'm going over here.
Yeah.
And I'll be okay. It will suck, but I will be okay. And just to bring that into relationships sets the other person free, and chances are you'll get the best out of them in that circumstance anyway.
Yeah, very good. Paula, last one. We started talking about it just before we started, but a lot of people, especially now, are looking at the dreams for their lives, what they thought would happen, what's actually happening, the kind of pressure they're in, and they're kind of going like, God, I feel like you're letting me down, or life is just too tough, or I just don't want to get out of bed in the morning. How does the gospel apply to dreams unfulfilled?
So I think there are two answers to that. I'm so glad I haven't like a neat answer. For once, I'll be terrified of every question you're about to ask me. The first is that if God can fix the enemy of God problem, like if His grace is that powerful, and I don't know if I did a good enough job of this on Sunday, but like really to get the sense of, for Him to overcome that, to take a wretched sinner who was on death row rightfully and adopt them as His children. Like if His grace can do that, it can do anything. And so there's this, I'm just so convinced as I look at my own, uncertain future, as you look at your uncertain future, as if you think about all the things that you had wished should have come true by now and haven't, or that you were hoping against hope and you've now said that really tragic line, I had hoped, like you've given up. You were God's enemy and He fixed that. So fill in the blank, whatever it is that seems at risk, surely, how much more can you have grace in your life? So that's the first half of the answer, that there is always hope. But the second half of the answer is also, and even if He kills me, like Daniel in the lion's den, like I'm not going to worship you, or the fire, whichever one of those. I'm not going to worship you, and your pagan thing. God can rescue me, but even if He doesn't, I'm still not going to worship you. The gospel gives you this massively grateful perspective that says, even if the dream never comes true, even if it turns out from the outside looking in like a nightmare, even if God chooses to use you in some totally other way and give you some totally other future from the one you were hoping, the context is, I was on death row, and now I'm His child, and for eternity I'm going to enjoy His presence. For eternity I'm going to go on adventures with Him. For eternity I'm going to live in the kindergarten of the gospel. So like, life, do your worst. Yes, if He could solve this, that means there is so much grace that it's not going to take much for God to do something unutterably beautiful in your life. And He always does. Like He always works all things for good. But even if you don't have enough faith to imagine that, or even if you have to go, well, worst case scenario, that doesn't play out the way I hoped, the gospel still gives you this sense of an eternally glorious future to look forward to. So if the next 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, I know that sounds glib because 50 years of suffering is dreadful, but in the context of what the gospel promises us, these are but momentary troubles, says Paul.
Yeah. We have to wrap up there, but I'm going to give you some questions to discuss, and this Sunday I'm going to be talking about how you live, as Paul put it, that kindergarten child who's just anticipating the goodness of a parent, and that's how we want to be. But to kick you off, I want you to discuss, are you the, entitled child who doesn't really believe that God should be angry at my sin? Maybe that's where you're at. Maybe you're the functional atheist. So basically what that means is it's nice that God's there and maybe He's there for heaven one day, but when it comes to day-to-day life, I'm on my own. I'm going to do it myself. And therefore you don't believe the gospel there. Or maybe you are gospel-centered. You wake up every morning going, God, I can't believe that you would do this for me. I can't believe that I, who was so full of sin, would have Christ pay that price that I could be so filled with love. And if you're that person, I would think that your joy is flowing. And if you're one of the other people, I think the next question is, what aspect of the gospel do you need to focus in on? What aspect of the gospel do you need to really begin to renew your mind on? And you can kind of zone in from some of our conversation around that as the second question. And then lastly, as we wrap this up, maybe you just want to talk about how you could apply the gospel to some aspect of your life this next week. My prayer is that the Holy Spirit will somehow anoint the message of what God's done for you and in you to such an extent that tomorrow when you wake up, there'll be a sense of the gospel defines who I am. I pray that you have a great evening. Thank you for joining us, and sorry for the break, and we will see you on Sunday. So looking forward to seeing you. God bless.